In the beginning, coffee, and lo, it was very good. Well, greetings and salutations. Welcome to another episode of Coffee, the Bible, and Page, and the last of our Christmas series, the Christmas Chronicles Part 4, where today we speak about the Magi. Now, how incredible would it be, do you think, to do something so amazing that it would resonate with people 400 plus years later? Two people come to mind, Palestrina and Daniel. Palestrina's writings and his compositions are still used today as a foundation for teaching music composition, even though he lived 400 years ago. His stuff is still relevant and current. In the same way, Daniel, a Jewish prophet living in Babylon, part of a Jewish diaspora, he wrote something that set into motion incredible events 400 and plus years later, after he wrote those words. You see, Daniel was a Magi, one of the Magi, a member of a powerful sect within the Babylonian Empire. He had incredible power and influence, and his writings and his influence set into motion events that would culminate 400 plus years later with this confrontation recorded in Matthew's Gospel. After Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea during the time of King Herod, Magi from the east came to Jerusalem and asked, "Where is he? Where is the one who has been born King of the Jews? We saw his star when it rose, and we have come to worship him." And when King Herod heard this, he was disturbed, and all Jerusalem with him. When he had called together all the people's chief priests and teachers of the law, he asked them where the Messiah was to be born. "In Bethlehem in Judea," they replied, "for this is what the prophet has written. But you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah, for out of you will come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel." Now, in almost every church pageant I've seen, it shows the Magi showing up in Jerusalem on 3 camels, and then kind of zipping over to the stable where the baby was in Bethlehem. But that's not exactly how it happened. Let's start here. Do you remember the earlier podcast where I said that the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus was God's end game? I compared it to a chess match where the players have opening gambits designed to set up their eventual end game, i.e. checkmate, the end of the match. I mentioned that the birth of Jesus was the opening gambit of God's end game. But that's not entirely true. The true opening gambit, if you will, in my opinion, for this end game of God's actually occurred centuries before Messiah was born, centering on a young man from a destroyed nation whose name was Daniel. Daniel eventually became part of a powerful organization within the Medo-Persian Empire known as the Magi. Now, the cast of the Magi can be traced back in scriptures to Babylon during and after the exile. In Babylon, they were first known as wise men, and this included magicians, enchanters, sorcerers, astrologers, etc. It's also clear from Daniel, chapter 2, that Daniel and his friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, were considered part of this cast of men known as the wise men of Babylon, who were to be advisors to the king on a great breadth of subjects, including religion, science, philosophy, and politics. And when the Persian Empire conquered the Medes, there was a priestly caste among the Medes known as the Magi. And when the Persians conquered Babylon, as recorded in the 5th century of Daniel, as well as in secular history, they brought this Magi caste with them, and it is clear from the biblical record that Daniel was one of those among the wise men of Babylon that were absorbed in this class of Magi. Now, from this class of men came many of the satraps or leaders that Darius appointed to help rule this diverse kingdom. Daniel was chosen as one of the 3 administrators to which the 120 satraps chosen by this king were accountable. It was Darius's plan, as expressed in verse 3 of Daniel 6, to put Daniel over the whole kingdom, which seems to have been done after this whole den of lions event. Daniel himself did not return from the exile to Jerusalem when Israel was given permission to rebuild, but he remained in Babylon, probably too advanced in years to consider returning. And it's reasonable that many of those within the caste of the Magi, who were also Jewish, did not return, as their positions of power and responsibility would have given them a life that would likely have been chosen over the hardship of those who would return to the destroyed city of Jerusalem. Daniel's book would have been written in Babylon, and it's reasonable to conclude that the Magi who came looking for Jesus, the Messiah, used their knowledge of astronomy coupled with the writings of Daniel to find Jesus. They would have been familiar with and possessed in-depth knowledge of the writings of the prophet Daniel, which would have been who was a revered Magi and a prophet. So, the Magi would have known that from the time of the rebuilding of Jerusalem to the time that the Anointed One, the ruler, is killed will be a fixed amount of years. Because Daniel's prophecy pointed at the time when Jesus would be killed. So it makes sense. They knew basically when he was going to be killed, and it makes sense that they could just backtrack from that 30 years or so to find the approximate time when he would be born. And that would have sent them on their journey to find this King of the Jews. They don't know about Bethlehem. They just went back to where it all began, with the intersection between Babylon and Israel, which would be Jerusalem. Besides, think about it. A Jewish king started the Jewish capital, Jerusalem. That the Magi would have gone to Jerusalem makes sense. To ask about specifics then about where is this King of the Jews that their prophet Daniel had written about. Now, why was Herod upset by the appearance of the Magi? Well, the title Magi comes the old Persian word Magav. I'm sure I'm not pronouncing it right, but that's as close as I can get, which refers to a very wise hereditary priestly tribe of people who came from the Medes. We also get the word magistrates from the original word of the Magi. The Magi were so powerful in their culture that historians like Herodotus tells us that no person was able to become king except under 2 conditions. He had to master the scientific and religious discipline of the Magi, and he had to be approved and crowned by the Magi. They were therefore sometimes referred to as kingmakers. Now, having through the years risen to a place of prominence in the kingdom of Babylon, Media, and Persia, they served as advisors to rulers. And so the term became synonymous in many ways with being a wise man. They were wise men. Now, politically speaking, Rome was strategically concerned with the Eastern Empire of Parthia, or Persia. Rome had stretched its tentacles out to rule the world, but they never really felt secure about the Parthian Empire because they never conquered them. In fact, Israel, who was situated between these 2 powers, actually became a battleground between these enemies at 63, 55, and 40 BC. Rome's anxiety over the Eastern Empire was accurately reflected in Herod's response to the arrival of the Magi. We see in Matthew chapter 2, where he says, when Herod the king had heard these things, he was troubled. When he heard that Magi, the Oriental Parthian kingmakers from a nation that Rome had never conquered, had arrived in Jerusalem, he became justifiably politically insecure. In fact, the word when it says he was troubled and all Jerusalem with him, the Greek word for troubled conveys the idea of agitating like a washing machine, literally shaking. All of a sudden, think about it, all of a sudden, a small military contingent from Persia arrives in Jerusalem, and he panics because he, as the king of Israel, was not the king these kingmakers were inquiring about. The new king they were coming to find would therefore be considered by Herod a threat to his throne. At the time of Christ, in the Eastern Empire, the Parthians, Persians, the Magi were a ruling body who would be similar in function to the United States Senate, totally composed of Magi who had the right of absolute choice for the selection of a king. As I said before, they were called kingmakers. And when the Magi arrived in Jerusalem asking for the whereabouts of this new king that had been born, Herod panicked. Naturally, knowing that these Persian kingmakers had come to find a king. Can you understand Herod's concern? Here comes representatives of another formidable and potential enemy government who stand before the Rome-appointed king of Israel and ask for the location of the king of the Jews, inferring that, Herod, you're not that guy. Why would all of Jerusalem be disturbed at the arrival of the Magi? Consider this. These aren't just three smart guys riding camels. They represent a ruling, powerful, priestly part of a culture that Rome is in conflict with and had never conquered. They, representing a powerful class in the Eastern Empire of Persia, would be traveling in full force with all of their Oriental pomp riding Persian steeds rather than camels. In fact, according to John MacArthur, they would have accompanying them a contingent of Persian cavalrymen as their escort. So, this military contingent and the Magi show up in Jerusalem and they find Herod and they ask, where's the king of the Jews? Oh, Herod, you're not it. Since these kingmakers came asking for another king other than Herod, Herod, of course, is very nervous. So he calls together all of the people's chief priests and teachers of the law and says, where's the Messiah to be born? And they told him, in Bethlehem. That being the last piece of information that the Magi needed, they left for Bethlehem. Now, during his conversation with the Magi, Herod discovered when they began their journey, he did his own math. He made a decision of his own about this king that the Magi were searching for. And so that's why he decided to send his soldiers to kill all the children of Bethlehem, all the boys that were 2 years old and younger, hoping to get rid of the future king that these kingmakers had come to his castle, his palace, to tell him about. Kind of puts a whole different spin on the whole story about the Magi, doesn't it? First of all, they represented a class of people in an enemy empire of Rome that were known to be kingmakers. I don't think they were there to make Jesus king. They just came to worship him. They came to worship the one that their predecessor, Daniel, had told them about 4 centuries previous. Matthew says they worshiped him and gave parents gold, frankincense, and myrrh, honoring the one that would be the true king of the Jews, the Messiah. They gave frankincense, gold, and myrrh to Mary and Joseph. That would be used to support Mary and Joseph in their upcoming adventure because they were soon to leave on the run to escape Herod and his deadly designs on Jesus. So let's just go over the timeline of the Nativity really quickly. 1, Mary has a visitation with Gabriel. 2, she goes to see Elizabeth. 3, she comes home 3 to 6 months pregnant. 4, Joseph takes her as his wife, even though she's pregnant with a child other than his own. He takes her to Bethlehem with himself. That's 5. 6, the Levitical shepherds were visited by angels and went to worship Jesus. 7, much later, the Magi arrive, worship Jesus, leave gifts, and return to Persia. And 8, Joseph and Mary flee from Herod's wrath and travel to Egypt for a time before returning to Nazareth. The Magi are no longer as much of a mystery to me. The Magi that visited Jesus and Joseph and Mary were descendants of the Magi who were introduced to the Holy Scriptures by Daniel 400 plus years before the Incarnation. Daniel, a Jewish man, promoted to high office in his captor's government, writes a prophetic message that would be followed by his order of the Magi at the appointed time to find Messiah. Scripture puts it this way. They went on their way, and the star they had seen when it rose went ahead of them until it stopped over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they were overjoyed. On coming to the house, they saw the child with his mother Mary, and they bowed down and they worshipped him. Then they opened their treasures and presented him with gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. I have no idea if Daniel intended for anyone to go find the king of the Jews 400 years later, after his death. I get the sense that Daniel was simply doing what God designed him to do. I believe Daniel was being what God designed him to be in that moment. He was part of a conquered people who made the best out of his circumstances. He pursued God, and he let the chips fall where they may. And that, dear people, is where I draw my encouragement from the story of the Magi. I'm focused on being what God has called me to be. I strive to do what God has called me to do. I move from moment to moment, striving to discern God's will for me in that moment. It may very well be that generations from now, something I have done or said in my life will be of significance. I don't know. I refuse to think that far ahead. But I know this: Daniel governed and he prophesied, he wrote, and then he died. 400 years later, the words he wrote led people to the feet of Messiah. God's end game began in Babylon 400 years prior to the birth of his son. Glory. Glory. Merry Christmas. I'm Paige. Here's my coffee. Folks, I'm out of here. God bless you. Bye-bye. I hope you have enjoyed my 4 parts to the Chronicles of Christmas. And I hope that you will give thought to the enormity of the events that surrounded the birth of our Savior. I will be taking the rest of December off because I will be preparing for January's launch into my devotional series on John's Revelation. I'm looking forward to that. I'm excited about it, and there's a little trepidation involved in it too, because that's deep waters for me. Apocalyptic literature is tricky to navigate. So I hope you'll join me in January as I begin John's Revelation. And until then, have a Merry Christmas and an incredibly Happy New Year. God bless you. Bye-bye. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to email me at page@coffeebiblepage.com. And please feel free to visit my website, www.coffeebiblepage.com, to see my blog posts and to listen to past podcast episodes. I hope to see you there. Have a great day. God bless you. Bye-bye.